You may recall, I think about a month and a half ago or so, where I was kidding with you, and I told you that I somehow got my terms mixed up, and I was going for a biopsy, and for some reason I was telling people I was going for an autopsy. And Liz was the one that pointed that out to me, pointed out my mistake, and I got thinking maybe I was about the only one who was able to come to work 2 days after my autopsy, except for perhaps Lazarus. But of course Lazarus didn't have an autopsy, and neither did I. So where am I going with this? Well, I'm not really sure, but I just thought, thinking about Lazarus and his being raised from the dead, isn't it interesting how we can sometimes get confused? And sometimes I think even this story can be confusing. But there's so much in this. There's so much power in this story of Lazarus. Lazarus, Mary and Martha, as I said to the kids, they were good friends with Jesus. And Jesus spent time in their home. And Jesus would go there to eat, and he'd sometimes probably go there to sleep. He knew them well. He knew them well. So when Lazarus became sick, it was kind of an obvious thing for Mary and Martha to send word out to Jesus saying, "Your brother, the one you love, Lord, is sick." And they fully expected him to arrive very shortly. And I think they were shocked when they found out that he wasn't coming right away. And don't forget that Jesus loved Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And yet notice when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he said, "We're going to stay here 2 more days." And that's what they did. And that one sentence, "He stayed where he was 2 more days," is a sermon in itself. Because God's timetable is not our timetable. And sometimes we like to fit God into our own lives in the way that we think it should work. And then when it doesn't happen, then sometimes we blame God a little bit. And sometimes, we're praying on something that's very important to us, and yet we don't feel as though we've gotten the answer. And it's almost as if God is silent. But that's what faith is all about. Faith is all about continuing to believe in God and in God's providence, even in those moments when he may feel like he's silent or he's somewhat distant from us. But if we knew that God heeded our every wish and followed our timetable as we wanted it to be, faith wouldn't be faith. I don't know what it would be. It would be something else, but it wouldn't be faith. So Jesus lingered where he was 2 more days, and then after the 2 days, he said to the disciples, "Let's go to Judea." And they were concerned about him going there because he had not received a good reception there. In fact, there were people there who tried to kill him, and so the disciples tried to discourage him from going. But Jesus says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." The disciples misunderstood. They thought Jesus was talking about ordinary sleep. They didn't realize he was talking about Lazarus' death. But this is the other side of faith. You know what? When we pray over something and we feel like that answer is just not coming, we have to remember that we will not be forsaken. Christ works on a different timetable than we do. And sometimes it's even a long time where that absence seems to be there. But it's only temporary. He has not forsaken us. Neither will he forsake us. My thoughts this morning are kind of scattered a little bit because they go to a cousin of mine. Sadly, he was 29 and 27. And I got word yesterday from his aunt that he had gone ice fishing on Friday morning and didn't return Friday night. And yesterday, the police and everyone else went out there to the lake, and they found where his snow machine had gone through the ice. And so probably as we are here today, they are searching for his body. 27, young boy at home, another one on the way, only married maybe 6 years ago or so. And I think of his parents, I think of Lindsay, his wife, I think of his young son, the unborn child. And I can just imagine what their prayers are like this morning. And I can imagine that perhaps they feel too that God was silent through this and have many questions, and that question of why always comes up. No matter how hard we try to push it down, that question of why comes up. And we have to deal with that in some way. And how do we deal with that? We deal with that in faith. Jesus may seem to be absent from us for a time, maybe sometimes even a long time, but his absence is temporary. He has not forgotten us. On his arrival in Bethany, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, that's important, that 4-day time frame, because you see, many Jews back then believed that it took 3 days for the soul to leave the body. And so therefore they would instruct you that if you had lost someone and you had buried them in a tomb, that you ought to do vigil for 3 days, because it was in that 3-day period that the soul finally leaves the body. And after 3 days, there's nothing left. There's just rotting flesh. And so you see, it was important that Jesus didn't show up until the 4th day. He showed up on the 4th day because, you see, that was a statement that Lazarus was really dead. And so no one could conjecture that perhaps Lazarus was only sleeping, or that he was in a coma, and Jesus happened to just kind of shake him awake somehow by his loud voice or by the rolling away of the stone. Lazarus was dead, and those 4 days is one way of giving evidence to that fact. There was no life left in him. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. Mary stayed at home. Isn't that interesting? Remember the story of Mary and Martha? I think we talked about it about some months back. And the fact that Mary is the one who sat at Jesus' feet, and Martha was the one that was always busy doing things. And Jesus praised Mary for what she was doing, and he talked to Martha about what she was busy doing and that she was missing the better part, and so on. But isn't it interesting that the one first to meet Jesus was Martha? And so you see, sometimes we're quick to judge, right? Sometimes we're quick to look at people and say, I don't think that guy's faith is really very strong, or this person over here isn't living the life that he should be or she should be, or we have no idea what the circumstances behind each person is. And I think sometimes we try to play God. We have no right to judge someone else's salvation. And we've got to be careful how we judge our brother and sister too, in terms of the depth of their faith. Here comes Martha, running to meet Jesus. And what does she say? She says, I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. So you see, even though Martha may have been busy doing stuff, she was listening. And somewhere along the line, her faith was growing. And there was Martha, the first one to meet Jesus, and say, Jesus, I just know that even now, God will do what you ask. So then Mary shows up. But before she does, there's some very important words that are shared between Jesus and Martha. Let me just review. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? And Martha gave a testimony of faith, and she said, oh, yes, Lord. She said, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who came into the world. I just pray that when we're in a moment, such as the moment of the parents of that young man, of Nathan was his name, by the way, and his wife and so on, in that kind of a moment, I just pray that each one of us in the throes of crisis will be able to make just such a confession of faith. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so when Mary reached the place where they were, Mary too says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And what does Jesus say? He says, Mary, where have you laid him? And she says, come and see. Now that's an interesting phrase, come and see. If you read the Gospel of John, you'll see that phrase shows up a number of times. Jesus says, come and see, come and see. Sometimes we think our eyes are necessary to visualize something in order to believe it within our heart. And that helps. And maybe that's why God gave us the gift of vision. But that's not the only thing that qualifies something as a true miracle of the Father in heaven. And that is the faith that's within our heart. And we just know that God is acting in a particular moment. And he's acting here right now as we gather here this morning. He's wanting to fellowship with you. And he's wanting to draw close to you. And he's wanting to call you out like he called Lazarus out. He's longing to do that with all of his heart. Where have you laid him, Jesus says. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And when Jesus saw Mary weeping and the others around her weeping, the verse says Jesus wept. Now, I don't know about you, but some days in my Sunday school years, that was a handy verse. Because when the teacher would say, recite a verse from the Bible, I could say, Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. But how powerful that verse is. Real tears. Jesus shed real tears because Jesus cares about every single aspect of your life and of mine. And you know, I believe that when we shed a tear, when we mourn, and when we cry, God cries along with us. Because he feels our suffering, he feels our hurt. Now here's the interesting thing. Some of them looking on were skeptical when they saw this. And they grumbled and they said, could he who opened the eyes of the blind not also stop this man from dying? There's a lesson in that too. I learned that very quickly, sadly, in ministry. It seems no matter sometimes what you do, you can stand on your head, you can drink water standing on your head, and still it's not enough. You're always going to find those who will complain or those who will have a problem no matter what's going on. It's sad. But then again, there's times when you have to be able to take these things and work with them and not dismiss people because they have concerns. And sometimes those concerns are deeper than what we know. And there's legitimacy to what they feel and what they are saying. But there are those too who will take the other vent and they will always say, see how he loved him. And they will see what Jesus is doing, and they will right away recognize that his tears are legitimate tears. Jesus sheds tears right along with us when we cry, when we mourn, as I know he's doing right now with that family in Barry's Bay. So they came to the tomb, and the cave had a stone laid across its entrance. And what does Jesus say? He says, take away the stone. That's another powerful sentence. I know of a pastor who does prison ministry. And he says that the most powerful passage that he finds working with the inmates is that one right there. Take the stone away. Because you see, it gives them some hope. The idea that the stone is rolled away, that they too can possibly step out into a new life. That stone of guilt and that stone of shame can actually be rolled away, and they can step out into a new life. And then Jesus called out loud, he said, Lazarus, come out. Another powerful phrase. Think about this. I had a pastor say to me one time, he said, boy, he said, it was good that Jesus limited that to Lazarus. It's a good thing that he mentioned Lazarus' name only, or he said the whole cemetery would have got up and would have left. And I never thought about it that way. But that's the power of Jesus' words. And that's also the intimacy of his words. You see, his thoughts were on Lazarus. And his thoughts are on you. His thoughts are on you, no different than the way were on Lazarus that day when he said, Lazarus, come out. He was called to a new life. And you and I can be called to that new life too. I find that this story has a few other lessons that I think are really important ones. And the one is that I think is the most obvious, that there is actually resurrection. There is resurrection. There is. Christ performed that task more than once. And he called to the dead and they arose. There is resurrection. There's resurrection not just for Lazarus, but there's resurrection for you and me. There is resurrection beyond the grave. When I was at Zion Pembroke, there was a gentleman there who was a member of our congregation who died on the operating table. And I don't know exactly how long he was actually in that state of clinical death. But it was long enough that they gave up using the paddles, and they gave up using any kind of method to kind of bring him back. He was dead. He was gone. But he was resurrected. And it wasn't a spoof, and it wasn't just a coma. He was pronounced clinically dead. And he speaks about what that experience was like. And he talks about kind of rising up from his body and looking down at himself on that table and seeing the doctors and the nurses applying the paddles again and again and seeing his body jump every time they applied the paddles. And seeing other moves, everybody rushing around, trying to revive him. He could see all of that. And then he talks about seeing a great light and then being right in the presence of Jesus. And he said feeling so much peace and so much love and so much joy that he'd never ever felt before. And he wanted it never to stop. It was just so meaningful, so powerful. But then he felt that it was coming to him. It wasn't spoken aloud in words, but it was coming to him that he was to go back and not remain. And that he had a mission and he had a ministry. And with that, he woke up in the recovery room. Can you imagine what that was like for those nurses and doctors who probably pushed him off to the side, and then all of a sudden he was awake again? And that man, to this day, he knows that he has a mission, he has a purpose, and that is to tell others that it's all true, that the resurrection is true, and that he personally experienced that resurrection. My grandfather, which was someone that my son Stephen came very close to before his death. My grandfather passed away at the age of 99. And my son has very interesting dreams, even as a child. And I sadly very seldom, if ever, dreamed of my grandfather. I would love to have a dream of him. Stephen dreamt of him only about a month after he passed away. And he experienced the deep faith that my grandfather had. And so he said to my grandfather in this dream, he said, "Grandpa," he said, "is it all true? Is the Bible true? Is resurrection true? Is heaven for real?" And you know the answer he got? My grandfather said to him, "Yes." He said, "It's all true, but it's nothing like anything you can ever imagine. It's all true." There's going to be a time, when the doctors and the nurses and medicine won't be able to heal me anymore or heal you. But we know one thing for sure, and that is there's going to come the day, the moment, when Jesus says to you, Doug, come out. Krista, come out. Ed, come out. Harshit, come out. I could name every single person here who knows the Lord and loves the Lord. That day is going to come. And I long for that day. This story affirms the resurrection. Not just Lazarus' resurrection, my resurrection and your resurrection. And this story also gives us hope for everyday living. It's a word of encouragement. It's a word that allows us to realize that our lives too can have a new beginning, because that's what Christ does for us. He gives the power for us to start all over again. Regardless of the circumstances of our lives, he gives us the power to start over again and the courage to face up to it all and to live again. And we need to hear this Lazarus account because, some of us are in perhaps a holding pattern with respect to our faith. There may have been a time perhaps when with great exuberance we opened our arms to the Lord and we welcomed him. And that might have happened over and over again through our life. And then there's times too when we kind of maybe just pull away. We sort of drift from the shore, if you know what I mean. And if that's the case, this story is for you. This story is for you, that you can have that new beginning if we put our faith in him. This is good news for all of us, that we can begin again, that our faith can be built again, we can have new life, we can live that abundant life that Jesus talks about. Take off the grave clothes, Jesus says. Get rid of them. Put the past behind you, because Jesus is now forgiving you for whatever guilt or shame or whatever has happened in your life. He's forgiving you. Just like he welcomed Lazarus back and gave him a new life, he's going to do that for you. Have you really put your faith in him? Have I really put your faith? Do we trust him? Are we willing to give our life over to him, to his guidance, his direction? Somehow, we may have lost faith along the way, but Jesus has never lost faith in you. This is Lazarus' story, and it's your story, and it's my story. Jesus is speaking to us today, and he's saying, come out. Come out of whatever it is that's holding you back from giving your life in fullness to me. Come out. I remember at our school one day, a public health nurse came. And she had her stethoscope. And she was checking the heartbeat of the children. And of course, you know how the children love to be able to then have I'm not sure the ends that put in your ears and put in their ears, and they can hear their heart beating like this. And I remember one time she did that with a little junior kindergarten. He was only 4 years old. And so she put the hearing buds into his ear, and then she took the round part of the stethoscope and applied it to his chest. And I was there at the time, and it was so precious. And she said to him, now what do you suppose that is? And of course he could hear that thump, 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 and his eyes grew wide, and he heard that tap, tap, tapping deep in his chest. And then his face broke out in a wondrous smile. And you know what he said to her? He said, is that Jesus knocking? Maybe so. Maybe Jesus is knocking at the door of your heart right now too. Not that he hasn't been there before and knocked and been there and you've opened the door, but maybe that door has to be open one more time. And he's calling you out from whatever it is that you're in. And he's saying to you, take off the grave clothes. Come out. Come out. Amen.